Yeah. Right. Yeah, I'm good here now. Thank you. Appreciate your help. Thank you. Okay. Thank you. So is that you right here? Okay. I can let you in.
So if you try to, or are you in as host? Okay.
Oh, I gotta turn my video on.
Yeah. So now I go into the Zoom so that Colby can admit you, and then he'll make you the host.
We had a few user errors here this morning, Lawrence. So
Happens.
every day's a new adventure, right?
That's right. That's right. I start the day with user errors. Well,
sometimes me too. It's not my favorite way to start, but sometimes it is what
I got
it is.
used to it. How's Dr. Everett today?
Good morning. How are you guys?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Nice to meet you and appreciate your time, and thank you for being with us.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I really like your backdrop there too. That's neat.
Yeah.
This way you don't see my messy room.
Yeah.
You've got quite the backdrop there, Lawrence.
Yeah, that is my messy room.
Oh,
it's like that's what's happening inside, it's like ugh.
and taught courses in international economics there, and among my students there were a fairly large group of Ukrainian students, and so all of this was before 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. And already at that time, relationships between Ukraine and Poland were particularly friendly. And Poland has a large group of natives from Ukraine already at that time, of course, and that's way before the current situation when there are so many refugees in Poland and as well as other countries too.
Mm-hmm. So tell me about the studies a little bit anyway, about the studies that you did in Poland relative to food and agriculture and that kind of thing. What kind of things were you looking into?
My main emphasis while I was in Poland was teaching. Really, I was applying my, if you want to call it that, expertise that I have here in this area. I was teaching international economics together with agricultural policy. And we did do a little bit of research on the European Union. And then later on, I worked with a professor from Poland, from Warsaw University of Life Sciences, on a study on Ukraine, but it was basically learning about their agricultural situation.
I would say the big picture, the 50,000-foot view, is why should we care as South Dakotans? Why should we care about the Ukraine and or world events? Can you give us some insight into that? Yeah,
so I've kind of thought about this question in preparation for our talk here, our communications. And first and foremost, in my view, why we should care is, of course, the humanitarian tragedy that is besetting Ukraine and that is affecting the rest of the world, which I think consists of two parts, which I already indicated. So first and foremost, it's directly impacting the Ukrainians, which are being bombed to pieces, if I may be so blunt. And besides that, is of course, Ukraine has long been known as the breadbasket of Europe and sometimes referred to as the breadbasket of the world. And they've, together with Russia, traditionally have exported a lot of agricultural commodities to many countries that rely on these basic commodities to produce bread and other products. And so particularly countries in the Middle East and then in the parts of Africa also rely on particularly wheat from Ukraine and Russia. And much of that those exports have been kind of halted. And so when it comes to wheat, before the war, together, Russia and Ukraine were responsible for exporting about 30% of all wheat trade across the world. And then in addition, products that stand out are vegetable oils, so cooking oils. Ukraine is still a big producer of sunflower oil, and that's used in many countries for cooking purposes. So why we should care, I think most of all from a humanitarian perspective, but then also besides, it has a huge impact on the rest of the world. The war has a huge impact on the rest of the world when it comes to food security issues. And you read the report, we were already in not such good shape after COVID, if we can call it after COVID, because maybe we're still in the middle of COVID, but sort of post-pandemic, is that an estimated 345 million people in the world are facing severe food shortages, and then over 800 million face degrees of hunger, and they're in part affected by these limited food exports from Ukraine. And I mentioned Russia also, and it's of course the case that Russia somewhat voluntarily decided to reduce its exports also of these commodities. And so it kind of it made it very difficult for a lot of countries.
Yes. Now, I would imagine that has some kind of ripple effect as well, both economically, politically, and of course, on the humanitarian scale. Can you talk about some of the specific effects that it has when we talk about hunger, for example, and if we talk about food shortages? I don't know that Americans find it very easy to grasp what that's like, what the picture of that's like. How does it change lives when it's not that, even if you had money, food is just not available? What does that do to a society?
Yeah, I cannot speak to that issue from personal experience, but professionally, when I teach about agricultural policy issues, food policy issues, we are of course deeply concerned about the issues. As I mentioned already some numbers, a large number of people that face hunger. The reason for the Ukrainian war having such an impact on that issue is that a number of countries are very dependent on food imports from their perspective, imports coming from Ukraine. And so while Ukraine traditionally prior to the war had 18 ports, 5 of those are in Crimea, and so those in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, then Ukraine already lost 5 of these ports, so they were left with 13. Now they still cannot use several of these ports, and they're left with about 6. 3 of those are along the Danube River. So they basically try to circumvent the bombing of these harbors along the Black Sea. And so Ukraine is very limited in the way it can export its vast wheat and other agricultural products. And so what that means, it's affecting supply chain, global supply chain. It's not only reducing grains coming out of Ukraine and then Russia also, but it means that there's normally countries rely on an amount of product that comes out of these two countries, and now that amount of product is no longer there, and many countries that are accepting wheat would normally subsidize bread production, but these countries find it very difficult to buy their input, wheat and other grains, at low enough prices, and so they find themselves getting further in debt because they cannot afford these now higher prices of these of wheat and other products. So that means that it makes economically for these countries, it makes it more difficult. In addition to, of course, the direct impact on people not having not enough food in some of these countries. So that we have, the direct impact, and then we have the financial impact on the of these countries also.
Mm-hmm. I think we may have gotten a little bit ahead of maybe a few people here if we talk about food chain. So I'd like to sort of backstep a little bit and talk a little bit about what a supply chain, particularly a food supply chain, is, and kind of how, in a nutshell, how does it work?
Mm-hmm.
What happens? Yeah, I mean, there's food out on the field, or some seeds in the field that grows, and then we're eating bread. What happens in between there that brings it to our table?
Yeah, well, in the case of Ukraine, the structure of the agriculture is such that about a large part of the wheat that's being produced there is produced by large scale type of agriculture. Other parts, there's a lot of small farmers also. So what you have is a lot of these small farmers, they find it very difficult to produce wheat. Some of the larger farmers have been able to continue producing, but they also face danger. So one of the issues in Ukraine is, if we start with the fertilizer, when we look at, where does bread come from? When it comes to the fertilizer, they have had a hard time getting access to fertilizer, low-cost fuel. So farmers have found it difficult to produce wheat in the way that they would normally like to do so. Input costs have increased, not to speak of course, the fact that they may, when they plow the field, they may run into a mine, not to speak of that. So what has happened is that the input costs have increased dramatically in Ukraine, because they can't find the inputs at the price that's affordable to them. So that's the fertilizer. So then let's hope that they can put the grain in the ground, the wheat in the ground, let's say as a winter wheat, like right now, and they harvest it in the summer, early summer sometime. The yields will be less than normal, smaller than normal, because of these reduced inputs. So that and then they find the difficulty of trying to get the wheat to the ports for exports, because traditionally Ukraine has exported a lot of its wheat, because again, they are the stereotypical breadbasket of the world, as I already mentioned. And so to get the wheat to the ports may cost them double or triple the amount of money that they would have had to pay for transporting the wheat to the ports. And then a lot of the wheat has been sitting in the ports because they haven't been able to get it. The transportation system hasn't been able to get it out. And so wheat is a global commodity. So you could argue, well, so what? Ukraine and Russia are no longer producing or allowing us to buy as much wheat as we would normally do, so we can just buy it from the United States. But of course, in the United States or Canada or Brazil, the farmers cannot just simply switch from one week to the next and produce a bunch more wheat. And so other countries have tried to encourage farmers to do more planting of wheat and other products, so that we wouldn't face the food shortages that we do. These food shortages have been, for a long time. This policymakers have seen this coming, but we're slow in trying to switch in such a way to make up for the losses the important losses that had been coming from that part of the world. So I don't know, Lawrence, if that's kind of helpful or.
Well, I think there's some more things I want to get into, because I'm not so sure that people understand like how food actually gets to our table. So that might bring some fog over like trying to understand, well, what's the disruption in that chain if you don't see the chain. But before we get into that, I want to open it up to our esteemed panel here. Now that they've joined us, we look for you guys to bring in your comments, questions, and this is a conversation. Evert and I, we can go on with this and get into some real thick weeds here pretty quick. But I want to know, like, what kind of questions do any of you or all of you have? And by the way, if you don't feel comfortable talking or having your face so we can see how cute you are, you could put it in the chat. You could write something in the chat and we'll transmit both either and or those questions to all of you, because you may have comments on other people's questions, but also to Dr. Van der Sluis. Anybody have questions? Betty looked like she has a question. Go ahead, Betty.
Hi, good morning. It sounds as if making up for these food chain interruptions is going to be kind of a slog to get it straightened out. And it sounds almost impossible to me under the conditions of war that we see on TV every day. Our speaker, Evert is his name, I believe, mentioned hunger. And I don't think very many of us in this part of the world truly grasp the meaning of that word in this context. So maybe he could clarify that a bit. And then it seems like those who are experiencing dangerous deprivation of food, they need urgent food. How does this, how do we bring those things together and hope to avoid the disastrous famine that it sounds like we're in for?
Yeah,
that's just some of my thoughts while I'm listening. Thank you.
Well, I mentioned large numbers. So the United Nations World Food Program estimates that, I mentioned this number, that 345 million people's lives and livelihood are in immediate danger of acute food insecurity, basically saying, if they don't get food next week, they are in severe problems. In addition, or included in that is that, or I should say, so the bigger number is that 828 million people face hunger, and that's a much bigger number than was the case in 2019. And that, so we're in this situation already because of COVID. And then we have things like the Ukrainian war that have made it far worse. And I would actually like to back up a second. We hear a lot about, and I'm kind of not trying to circumvent your or avoid the answering your question, but one thing we have to realize is that Ukraine has been in the news a lot. But when it comes to humanitarian crises, I recently saw somewhere, and I forget which I have it written down. Okay, the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, they listed some of the no, this is the International Rescue Committee. I'm sorry. So this is they list all the hotspots in the world, and they list Ukraine as number 10. And they list number 1, the situation in Ethiopia and Somalia, the part of Ethiopia that's called Tigray, where you have a minority group of people that are being cut off from the world, and where you have a large number of people dying, numbers actually being much higher than in Ukraine. It just so happens, and we can argue about why that is, but I think one reason is the strategic implication for Europe is one reason for why we hear so much more about Ukraine. But when it comes to purely humanitarian issues or situations, we have to remember that there are crises in the world that are even more severe than what we hear so much about in Ukraine, and I think that's an acknowledgement we ought to make, and ought to be something that we ought to all be aware of. So as someone who has been fortunate enough to never have experienced hunger, it's difficult for me to say how important that is. Where I grew up in the Netherlands, my parents were of the war generation, the Second World War generation. They did experience a time when hunger was severe due to conflict. And by the way, this is probably the biggest reason for why people in the world face hunger. It is because of conflict. When I talk in agricultural policy, I talk about the importance of being able to provide enough food for the world. The issue of hunger isn't necessarily a matter of production alone. Of course, we as economists, we're all very concerned about that, and about efficiency, and that we produce enough. But the issue of hunger, as I said, is not simply a matter of the amount of food that is being produced. It includes the distribution. It includes the type of food, if it's nutritious enough, and then also the timing of the food. So these are some of the issues when it comes to hunger. Like in some parts, we usually have enough food, but it could be because of drought that we don't have enough food to make it through the dry period, that kind of thing. But a big reason, as I already said several times, is conflict, and that's what basically what we see in Ukraine. While in Ukraine itself, people may still have access to enough food, the conflict results in having a shortage of food for many people in the world. So I don't know. This gets into very serious issues. Of course, but I don't know if I've fully addressed your question, Betty, but.
Thank you. That was very interesting and helpful for my own understanding. Appreciate it.
Well, I would say that vis-a-vis this supply chain issue, that there are a number of ways it seems like these conflicts hamper food distribution. And I think certainly we can be talking about a production issue, but it sounds like it's more of a distribution issue, that getting the food where it needs to go. And of course the distribution can start to go back uphill too, back to the production, because if people can't distribute the things that they already grew, it's a little hard to grow more stuff when you can't sell what you got. But can you talk a little bit about the points of disturbance as far as how the food distribution is disrupted what, can you talk a little bit more about how that happens?
Yeah, just like in the case of Ukraine. So they have these ports, Odessa being a famous one. But there are these 5 other ports that Ukraine still has access to. 3 are, having to do with the Danube River. But they're traditionally farmers in Ukraine were able to access these ports, deliver or transport their products, their grains and oil seeds to these ports. And then from there they would be transported by ship, by ocean carrier to the Black Sea or across the Black Sea through Turkey, through the straits there, and then being distributed across the world. Some of that goes to the Middle East. Several Middle Eastern countries would purchase let's say wheat from Ukraine and Russia, and then many African countries. So basically what you see is just like the pipeline was being disrupted, that the pipeline being that grain being shipped across the Black Sea is now being cut. And so the wheat can't get out. And the reason for why it is being cut is because it's just simply too dangerous when either the ports are being bombed, so the infrastructure is being destroyed for loading the ships, or the ships themselves it would be too dangerous to sail them across the ocean. So now what has happened in the case of Ukraine is under the leadership of the United Nations, Ukraine and Russia, and then also together with Turkey, those 4 parties have agreed in July of last year to enable shipping some amount of wheat and oil seeds from these ports through Turkey, where these ships, all of them would be inspected by Ukrainians and then also Russians. So this is an agreement that has been made that would last it for 4 months, I believe, until November. They then renewed it for another 4 months. So next month, we will see if this is something that continues. But the amount of wheat and oil seeds that has been exported from Ukraine has still been severely decreased over what they used to export. So it's in the neighborhood of 5 million metric tons per month, 5 to 8 that they used to export, and now they're in the neighborhood of 3.5 million metric tons that they're exporting. Then Ukraine, what does Ukraine try to do is then ship also some of these products, these commodities by rail, but that's much more expensive. And other countries have helped them with that, like through Poland and even indirectly some of the Baltic countries, but like Lithuania and Latvia. But this is much more expensive because shipping by ocean is much cheaper than it is to ship any product by land. I don't know.
And as far as I can tell, the rails are not going over the oceans either. So sometimes it's just not possible to get the stuff out there. So you can't get there from here.
That's right.
At least by train you can't. Now I want to open it up to our esteemed panel again. If you guys have any questions or comments on our subject today of Ukraine and the war there and the impact it's having on not only South Dakota, but in fact, the world as far as like disrupting particularly food supplies. Anybody have questions? Comments? Going once? Going twice? Well, okay, we'll continue. If you have questions, put them in the chat or write them down or raise your hand or something, so we'll know that you have something that you would like to contribute to this conversation. I'd like to talk about the political implications worldwide of food shortages and how the Ukraine may be impacting like political instability worldwide, and what implications would that have?
The political instability. Can you elaborate a little bit, Lawrence?
Okay, so let's say, for example, if you have people who are already kind of, let's say, not getting as much food as they would like, now this Ukraine thing happens and there's starvation. Well, when people have starvation, that changes people's minds, you know, I mean, and their alliances and what they will do, what they won't do, what they will put up with and what they won't. And also it makes people more desperate. You know, when you get hungry, you can become quite desperate. We can see that in some extreme cases where people even turn to cannibalism when they get hungry enough. So way before they get to cannibalism, there's some other changes in the brain and how people process what they will do and what they will tolerate and not. And it's hard to see how that wouldn't impact political instability in some way. So I'm just wondering, in other cases that that you have seen, have you seen examples of increased political instability in the face of hunger?
Yes, very much so. I think one of the famous cases, when about 10 years ago, whatever it was, I don't have my dates straight, but we learned a lot or heard a lot about the Arab Spring. And when economists look at this, they, yes, it was about political freedom or the demand for more political freedom and so on, but a lot of that was instigated because of higher food prices. So, for example, what was happening in Egypt is, and this is well known, is that Egypt would subsidize the price of bread, and so bread would be very cheap. And of course, bread is a staple type of food, and people rely on having access to that staple food, and then so the government would try to increase the price of or reduce the subsidies for bread, so which would lead to an increase in the price of bread. And that led to an uproar, and people were out on the street and demonstrating against the government, which then, and I think this is what you're getting at, Lawrence, is that this created a lot of political uncertainty and in fact put the government in jeopardy. So this is something that a lot of political systems, a lot of political leaders are very concerned about. They don't want angry mobs on the street and large crowds of people on the street because they would disagree with the policies of the government. So this is always an issue, and it was certainly something that contributed to the unrest on the Arab streets, as it was referred to at that time. And this is historically, there are many other examples like this where the same phenomenon is taking place. So this is something that political leaders are extremely concerned about. And so when we're talking about these countries that are importing these grains and oils from edible oils from Ukraine, these countries are deeply concerned about this. I mentioned earlier about having these countries not being able to afford the high prices that are demanded for these grains, but then of course that's filtered down to ordinary people who have to pay higher prices for food. Where in the United States maybe we spend less than 10% of course, this depends on the level of income that a person has. But if we spend a small percentage of our income on food, that is hard to imagine. But for those people who normally spend, maybe let's say up to half of their incomes on food, then if there's an increase in the price of food, that squeezes everything else that people have to spend money on, and that makes people very unhappy, and governments don't like to see unhappy people
Exactly.
for good
I
reason.
think, yes, I think that reason is term we use is hangry, when
That's right.
people, when people, they may be discontented about a lot of things, but are willing to just sort of like sweep them under the rug. But once there's a certain amount of hunger sets in, now people, it's easy to really tick them off. And then when they do, they're really off the chain, just do it. So it could present an instability, not just politically, but with the security of a country, when you have people who are just sort of run amok, because you can do so much, only so much, to control people through military means. And once they get really off the chain and they get a rolling riot going, you'd be wiping out a lot of your population. And in that population, you'd be also wiping out people who are critical to your infrastructure, people who make things happen, your doctors, the people who clean the streets. Well, if you run out of those people, you got a real problem. Even if you manage to quell things, it's not going to be pretty afterwards. One of the questions that came up in the chat was, it seems like in many of these cases, women and girls, some people think, I haven't seen the data on that, but it just seems like there is some indication that women and girls face the brunt of these kinds of situations. Have you seen that kind of those kind of studies, and can you talk about why that would be?
Yeah, I think it's very true. And this is one of the reasons for why there's such an emphasis in international organizations when it comes to policies regarding low-income countries, that I think there's widespread agreement that there's a need for empowering women, because oftentimes when women are the decision makers of the household, if women are empowered, that means that their children might be in better conditions. Also, they might face better conditions. And so this is a phenomenon that's generally true. And of course, when people are squeezed financially, then certain groups are going to be more affected by shortages than others, and so this is going to show up in that area. For example, an extreme case we learn about Afghanistan, right? That's high on that list of countries that I mentioned also, where the opposite of empowering women is happening, and that's going to throw Afghanistan even more in poverty, of course, not only because half of the population is not being utilized the way they could, and people are not being put to effective use, so to speak, if from that point of view. But it goes far beyond that, where usually it's the women who are the caretakers, and in many societies, and that means that the next generation would be far better off also if women are more empowered. So I would strongly disagree. I would strongly agree with that notion that it's affecting especially women, and then by extension children, and then the women of the future, the girls, so to speak. Absolutely.
Okay. I want to remind people again that we're open for questions and comments and that kind of thing. Let's move on now to your particular area of studies, economics. Of course, there's a political in that, but what does it do to world economics and particularly to South Dakota economics, when these kind of events take place in a place, especially a place like Ukraine, where their one of their main crops is one of ours. We do soybean, I mean, we do wheat and sunflowers as well. So when they drop out or pushed out or however, when they're out of the game to some extent, what does that do to us? And how does that affect us?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think one could make the calloused case, and nobody would say that out loud, that, okay, somebody else is having trouble. And so that means, or a major provider of wheat and oil crops is no longer in the market. That means that there's going to be a shortage, and that means that prices of these commodities go up, and that's good for us. That may be true to some extent, and we've seen some of that, but that's on the output side, meaning the crops. But on the counterpart is that we've also seen that access to fertilizer and other inputs has become much more difficult. So the price of fertilizer has increased if people were able to access that. And then, although right now the price has really gone down, but the price of oil was very high for a while also. So it's a sword that cuts from both sides. I think a knife that that cuts on both sides. There's that. The other thing is that it's created a lot of uncertainty. That wars in general create a lot of uncertainty. So here in South Dakota, we're less directly affected by that, but certainly nations in Europe have been reminded of this is the largest war that is taking place on the European continent since 1945, and so where food security is always an issue for Europe, and so they have been reminded that food security is at stake here, and is always precarious. In the United States, we're used to having an abundance of food, and you could argue that it is benefiting South Dakota to some degree on the producer side. On the other side, of course, we are all consumers of food also, and we know how. We hear a lot about inflation. Basically, inflation means prices are increasing, and so we've seen price increases of many food products, and this war is in part, at least, responsible for these high food prices. So we cannot solely attribute all these price increases to the war, but it is this combined issue with broken supply chains or supply chains that aren't working anymore the way we have been used to, is in part what has been leading to or contributing to these higher prices. So it's a mixed bag, and it's a complicated bag. The bigger picture is, of course, that this goes back to the argument of should we or should we not help other countries when it comes to their economic development. The short-sighted answer is no, we should not do that, because that means we can remain the sole producers of these products that we benefit from. The economic trade argument is that no, that's not the right argument. We need to help other countries develop so that they can purchase our products and we can buy their products that they want to sell to us. So, and it's a win-win situation overall. And you can tell that I would be in the latter camp. I think in general, trade would be good as long as countries follow the rules of international trade, which is a whole different argument, a whole different discussion that we could argue about. But in principle, that would be the approach that I would subscribe to.
Mhm. Well, it seems like to me, if we're talking about pure economics, then we would take one route. If, on the other hand, we're talking about domination, we would take another route, because we would want to make sure those countries never got the ability to feed themselves and would depend on us so that we can control them. At least that's what I've seen in my explorations around the globe, is that maybe this isn't an accident, because in fact, I remember having some, let's say, eye-level diplomatic conversations about such kinds of things, particularly in Burkina Faso, where our government, let's say, discouraged Denmark from building a road from the south of the country to the north, where the north was starving, the south of the country had lots of food. They were walking on it in the market, but they couldn't get it there because they didn't have a road. The Danes were going to build a road, a primary road, instead of that tertiary road that got washed out every year. But we didn't want them to, because they wouldn't let us put a base in their country so that we could go to war with Chad, which we had a disagreement with. And as a result, we actually paid more to fly the food to Burkina Faso than it would have cost the Danes to build that road. So I saw that as a primary case of how a country would say, hey, it's not in our interest to have those people be food sufficient. We need to have them depend on us or somebody else for food so that we can control them in that way. At least that was my assessment of what happened there. So I'm just wondering, like, not just in the case of Ukraine, which is more direct because somebody actually attacked them, but in general, is it just about economics, or is it sometimes world politics as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, of course, this is again, this would get in an area that I'm not all that well versed in, and you wouldn't want to necessarily hear my opinions about this. But there is the economic side, and then we have the political side, where there are a lot of parallels to what you were just describing, where we have Russia wanting to control what Ukraine can and cannot do. And then so far, what has happened is that the areas that are more or less being controlled by Ukraine in the eastern part of and by Russia, I mean, in the eastern part of Ukraine, those tend to be highly productive areas where it's not just agricultural output, but also heavy industry, where the Soviets built heavy industry, and then also mining products. So there are a lot of riches in that area that are now being controlled by Russia, and Russia wants to control it for its own benefit. And you could argue that, yes, there are a lot of people who have, and I've tried to follow that as much as possible. I look at, I try to learn from Timothy Snyder, for example, other authors who write a lot about the history of Ukraine and that part of the world, which is all very, very complicated. But beyond that, you could make the simple case that Russia, what it's really after is controlling, at least is controlling the riches that exist in Ukraine. And Russia is not the only country that has ever done that. Historically, the Germans tried to do that even in the First World War, again in the Second World War. It was about controlling the riches, or getting access to the riches of what Ukraine is capable of producing, because of the location that it is in, and then because of the riches, the natural riches of that part of the world. And again, Moscow wants access to these riches, and yes, control is a big part of that, I think.
One question that we have, because we're coming up on time, but one question is whether the Black Sea Grain Initiative is helping to alleviate some of the issues that resulted in that conflict.
Yes, to a degree, and I went into that briefly. So, yes, without that Black Sea agreement, Ukraine would be able to export even less than it is now. But that Black Sea initiative has resulted, well, I was saying before the war, Ukraine would export 5 to 8 million metric tons a month. And now it is down to 3.5. And what I read in the news reports is that Russia's trying to actively undermine that the agreement as it is, and then it's up for renewal in February. And so it remains to be seen what Russia is going to decide, together with the other countries that have implemented this, including Turkey. So it's helping Ukraine relative to where it was before the agreement was implemented, but it is in far worse shape now than it was before the war. So it's an in-between type of solution, and of course Ukraine would like to do much better than it is right now.
Well, that brings us to the point of where do we go from here? What's next? What are our options, and what are the likelihood of the various options?
Yeah, well, this could get, maybe I'm out of my my comfort zone here in this area, but there was an article by a person who wrote in the Guardian newspaper, and I kind of agree with what he said. He laid it out in very clear terms. He said there's basically 3 options. One is what has been talked about, regime change in Russia. That's probably not in the control of many countries, so that's an option that may or may not exist. And the second option was described as bleed them until it hurts and continue to bleed them, and that's sort of the situation where we're in right now. I think where the war is ongoing, Russia is creating a lot of damage, and it's throwing a lot of weaponry at or bombs and things on Ukraine. But it's sort of like a stalemate for everything that I read. And the third option, give them enough to defend themselves and retake some land. And so this is one that has been in the news lately, basically trying to tell the Ukrainians that they should negotiate with Russia. And then, so these were the 3 arguments, the 3 different options that would exist. And the person, this Frank Letwich was his name, who wrote this article in the Guardian on January 10th, he said, basically we need to look for option number 4, which is an unambiguous win for Ukraine. But what that would mean is providing even more weaponry, and not just defensive weaponry, but also offensive weaponry that would enable the Ukrainians to win. So I'm going beyond being, my economist role, but as we all do, probably we read a lot about this stuff. I would also, there's another article that Condoleezza Rice and Robert Gates recently wrote in the Washington Post that talks about this also, and basically tries to make the same argument that this stalemate is not going to be good for the United States in the long run, because the argument seems to be that, no, we don't want to offend the Russians too much, and we don't want this to go into a nuclear war. But even if we make an agreement with the Russians, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to back off from that. And so it's going to be interesting to follow all of this and see where it goes, especially political changes here in this country, and then all the amount of money that is being spent on this. So it's very costly as it is right now. again, these two pieces that I just referred to, I think they argue that, yes, it's costly right now, but it's going to be even more costly in the future. So where all of this is going to go, I don't know. But in the meantime, we have, again, I would come back to what I started out initially, is the humanitarian concern within Ukraine, and then everybody who's affected by all of this. That would be my, as an agricultural economist, would be the concern that I'm mostly worried about. So
Yeah. Well, we're at the end of our time pretty much, but I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that another particular possible road is World War III. You know, I mean, that's not completely out of, you know, that the whole thing could spiral out of hand. And from my understanding, that's kind of what we're trying to prevent, is like one of those kind of take one country, then two countries, then three countries, and then now you have a full-scale World War III. I think, you know, at least from the Russian side, it sounds like that's what, you know, they were saying, well, you know, you guys are getting too close and we're pushing back or whatever. But if they see that, well, we have to get a bigger buffer zone, you know, then I could see it really easily spilling out, because they have to sell it to their population too. And how do you sell it? Well, you sell it as we're victims. And that's why we have to do this, is because we're victims here. And if we don't stand up for ourselves and take a few countries along the way, then we could be, you know, like overrun or something. It's been an interesting discussion, Everett, as usual with you.
thank you.
I'm hoping everybody will come and join us next week, same time, same station. We will be here discussing having another brainstorm about the human connection. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks, Everett, again, and see you guys next week.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.